Alright guys, so last night President Biden had a pretty major press conference where I think most people were looking at it as sort of like his last-ditch effort to prove to the American people that he's not as senile as everybody thinks that he is and that he can be the 2024 nominee for Democrats. And I got a lot to get into here. We got a bunch of different clips that I've loaded up. There was a press conference that involved questions from reporters, and then there was also a press conference right before that where he was with a bunch of the NATO leaders that are in town, and he also had a pretty major gaffe from that, so I'm going to show you a couple of those there. I think just in and of itself, the fact that basically the entire country was on the edge of our seats waiting to see if the most powerful man on earth can string together coherent sentences, that situation is pretty wild in and of itself, right? That's where we're at right now. But that's where we're at right now. So here we go. I want to start off with this. We got Karine Jean-Pierre and John Kirby, some of Biden's top spokespeople, who were gearing up for these press conferences, and they had an interesting way of describing it. Let's go ahead and watch this real quick.
Big boy press conference. Big boy press conference. A big boy press conference. Hold a press conference. A big boy press conference.
Press conference. I guess a big boy press conference is what we're calling it. The press conference, the big boy press conference that y'all are planning to have.
Gives his press conference, his big boy press conference.
His big boy press conference. I mean, I feel like if you're having to talk about the president as if he's like sort of a child, right? Big boy press conference, then you're kind of already past the point of no return, right? I'll get into more of that here in a second when we get to some of the backlash and the piling on from many people calling on him to drop out. But it really just seems like we're so far beyond the point of no return for Biden. There's no way that he makes it through this, right? So we also move on here to the NATO press conference, right? So behind the scenes, we had some NATO leaders who were apparently unnerved by this weakened Biden. One of them said, "You're worried if he knows which direction he's going or whether he's going to fall or what he's going to forget," said one senior European diplomat. Now keep in mind, guys, this is one of Biden's supposed strong points, right? Is the fact that I kept NATO strong and we're doing a proxy war against Russia and we expanded NATO with Finland and whatever else the case may be. This is supposed to be one of his strong suits, right? Ironically, even though it's actually not that popular amongst the American people. But if this is one of your strong suits, and then all of these European leaders behind the scenes are either sort of like poking fun at you or they're deeply concerned about you, then that should maybe be setting off some red flags. I don't know. You guys tell me. Now we get to this. Because apparently Joe Biden couldn't even make it to the main press event where he was going to answer questions from reporters. This is from the event before the main press event, where he mixed up Zelensky and Putin. Let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this clip here.
I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. Who's going to beat President Putin? President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin.
Oh, God. Okay. So this is where we're at, guys. Now, again, it would be one thing if this was like a one-off misspeak. I do that all the time. Everybody does that. Everybody misspeaks. I'm pretty sure that I've called Jill Biden Jill Stein before, right? And some of you guys pointed that out in the comments. So we all make mistakes. But the fact of the matter is, this is not a one-off thing, right? This has been happening actually for years now at this point, and it seems like it's gotten significantly worse over about the last year or so. So it's not just a one-off thing. And it's also a problem for Biden because even if you want to be super generous to him and super overly fair to him and to say, well, he corrected himself and it's not that big of a deal, the fact remains that the vast majority of the country thinks that he's senile. They think he's too old to be the president. They think he's too old to run for re-election. And so anytime you have even just a small moment like this where he has some major fuck-up, that's all that people are going to remember. They're not going to remember the rest of his scripted teleprompter speech before that. They're just going to remember that he called Zelensky Putin. So it's not even like a thing that you can overcome, even if you believe that Joe Biden isn't fully senile at this point. It's just an electoral nightmare for him. So now we get to the actual press conference, right? And so this is, I'm not even kidding, guys. This was the first question. The first question. Now, typically when I'm watching an event like this with Biden nowadays, I sort of like half expect him to meander his way through it. He'll slip up and he'll stutter and he'll, have some issues here and there. But I sort of expect him to like semi-coherently get through these events, right? Because he's got sort of an advantage. He knew which reporters, he had a list of reporters to call on. He had a general idea of what the questions were going to be involving and all of that. And even with all of these advantages, he still made this massive error in the first goddamn question. Let's go ahead and watch this clip here.
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president that I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that...
Okay, so he couldn't even make it through the first question, guys. The question was basically centered around his age concerns and, you picked Kamala Harris as your vice president. Do you think that she could do the job of being the president of the United States? That was basically the question. And he responds by calling Donald Trump his vice president. And unlike the Zelensky clip, he didn't even catch this. He didn't even realize that he said this in the moment. He never corrected himself. He called Trump his vice president. The direct quote, "I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president if I didn't think she was qualified." Guys, what are we doing? What are we doing? Trump already, like within minutes of this happening, was on Truth Social making fun of him for it. I mean, I don't know how you can possibly at this point believe that this man can not only defeat Donald Trump, but then serve 4 more years after that. Does anybody believe that? Do people really believe he's going to be alive or cognitively there at all in the next 4 or 5 years? I mean, it's so absurd, man. I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump. So he called Zelensky Putin and Kamala Trump. Those are the 2 things that are going to stick in people's minds from what happened yesterday. We had a couple other clips. Here we have, a short little gaffe. Let's go ahead and listen to this one as well.
I brought on, I asked our NATO allies that we bring on a group from the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Australia. I already mentioned Australia.
I mean, it's just kind of sad. It really is just sad, man. I don't know if this was my family member, if this was my grandpa, if I was Jill and this was my husband or something. Do you not have any sort of empathy? Do you not care that everybody is watching this and just cringing inside at how difficult this is for him to make it through this, right? I mean, immediately off the bat, I didn't see this in the first clip I just showed you guys, but immediately off the bat, when he gets up there, when he was about to give his, because he did, sort of the first half of this press conference was a scripted thing, where he was reading off a teleprompter and talking about NATO and all of that, and then he started asking questions. But immediately, even in the scripted part, he wasn't passing the vibes test. He got up there, he was sort of doing his slow little stiff walk up to the stage. He gets up there, he's sort of mumbling under his breath like this, and he's he's coughing off to the side. He sounds like he's a dying old man. He just does not pass the vibes test, which again is another indication that even if you think in here mentally he's okay and he's fit to be the president, it just doesn't matter. Because, again, we're well past the point of no return. Everybody thinks he's senile. He's not going to be able to prove that he's not, because every time he gets up on stage, he's doing shit like this. Anytime that people or average Americans are watching him, they're saying, yeah, that kind of reminds me of my grandpa or my father who, had dementia when he was getting up there in age. We cannot see past that. You can't just gaslight people into oblivion to ignore what their eyes and what their ears are telling them. It's just not going to work. Now, one more here. This was an interesting quote from Biden about Israel.
A ceasefire and get those. And by the way, look at the numbers in Israel. I mean, my numbers are better in Israel than they are here. But then again, they're better than a lot of other people here too. But anyway.
My numbers are better in Israel than they are here. Now, number one, I think that's kind of true, because here in the United States, he has a 36% approval rating. I wouldn't be surprised if his approval rating in Israel is higher than that. But the other interesting polling data that he didn't mention here is that most Israelis actually want Trump to be the president over Joe Biden, right? Netanyahu wants Trump to be the president over Joe Biden, because even though he's been totally sycophantic and has done almost everything that Benjamin Netanyahu and the IDF have wanted him to do in regards to the genocide in Gaza that he has been fully complicit in, even with that, they know that Trump is even more so in that direction. He is going to bend over fully and allow Israel to do whatever they want to do. I mean, Trump was the guy who moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Trump was the guy who pushed forward with the Abraham Accords. Trump was the guy who let Sheldon Adelson give him, $100-200 million, and then basically decide his Israel policy. I mean, Trump is even somehow marginally worse than Joe Biden when it comes to doing anything and everything that Israel demands of him. So I don't know if it's even true on that front in terms of his numbers being better than Trump in Israel, but it's a pretty revealing comment nonetheless, right? Maybe this is a problem. Maybe this isn't a good thing. Maybe this isn't something to brag about. The fact that your polling numbers are better in a foreign country, not to mention an apartheid state that's in the midst of committing a genocide with our weapons country, than they are here domestically. Maybe that's part of the whole problem, Joe. I mean, man, it's just, what are we doing? What are we doing, guys? Another one here. We have Biden at the end of the press conference, once again, being extremely delusional about the current state of the race right now. So let's go ahead and listen to this last question, basically on like his electability.
You earlier explained confidence in your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying that. No poll says that. Okay. Thank you.
This ends tonight's press conference.
Okay. So I don't know what that weird whisper was at the end there. He does that sometimes where he like gets up close to the microphone and he's like, no, nobody's saying that. But it's not even true on top of that, right? The polling data has been an absolute disaster for him recently. There are many people right now, believe it or not, Joe, who are saying you have no chance of winning. In fact, there are many elected Democrats who would typically be seen as like your top allies, right? Corporate establishment Democrats who are behind the scenes saying he has no shot. In fact, it almost seems like that's the unanimous consent, not based on their public statements, but what they're telling reporters behind the scenes, is that pretty much all of the House Democrats, the Senate Democrats, don't believe that Joe Biden can win. And not only that he can't beat Trump, but that him being at the top of the ticket is potentially going to cost Democrats any chance at the House or the Senate. So the polling data has been an absolute disaster. I don't know if like his inner circle surrounding him is showing him warped polls or is cherry picking polls that look somewhat better for him. But even if it was, a toss up, even if it was a 50-50, is that not still alarming? Your opponent is Donald Trump. The man is a convicted felon. The man was already president, and his biggest accomplishment was giving a tax cut to billionaires and corporations. The same guy who did January 6th and all of that. You're telling me that you cannot crush Donald Trump into oblivion and crush the party that is essentially like in a cultish way following behind him? You cannot possibly defeat that man, the same guy who appointed the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe v. Wade, a massively unpopular decision. Even if this was a 50-50, that would still be a disaster. But guess what? It's not a 50-50. At this point, I think it's closer to like, it's an 80% chance at least, that Donald Trump wins, unless something drastic changes between now and November. So again, I don't know where he's getting his polling data from. I don't know what kind of delusional head-in-the-sand world that he's living in, but it's certainly not the same one as me. Now, moving on here, those were some of the main clips that I saw were floating around from the entire press event. So now we move on to the backlash, right? What are Democrats thinking? So this is just published from CBS News. 4 Democratic sources with knowledge tell CBS News that they expect dozens of Democratic lawmakers over the next 48 hours to issue statements calling for Biden to step out of the race. So far, I don't know the exact count because it's been fluctuating and some people have been going back and forth on it. But I think we've at least hit a handful, right? Maybe 5 or 6 or so of elected House or Senate Democrats who have openly called for Joe Biden to step out. If that handful or so turns into dozens of Democrats, then we're talking about a completely different picture here, right? And something that was interesting at the end of that press conference as well is he actually said that he was open to the delegates at the DNC convention that's coming up pretty soon in a month or so or 2 months. He said he was open to them voting for somebody else, selecting somebody else to be the nominee if they don't believe that he can win. And I thought that was really interesting because as defiant as he is about staying in the race, he basically was like, well, if they don't think I'm the guy, then they can pick whoever their conscience tells them to pick. So that could be what ends up happening if Joe Biden still refuses to drop out, even with potentially dozens of other Democratic lawmakers openly coming and calling on him to drop out of the race. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens moving forward. We also have this here from Andrew. He says Senate Democrats got heated with Biden advisors, according to 2 Dem senators who were present. A number of Dems told the Biden team that they were, quote, being put in an untenable position defending something that so many of their constituents felt was obvious. And this is why you've also seen recent polling data showing that the amount of Americans who believe that Joe Biden is trustworthy and honest has basically fallen off a cliff. And I think for pretty obvious reasons, especially recently, like, if you're going to come out and insist that everything is fine, he's perfectly with it, he's actually running circles around everybody who's around him in these behind closed doors meetings, and he's mentally there, and then the American people see him get up, collapse during the debate, have all of these gaffes during these press conferences, then yeah, people are going to start to doubt whether or not you're an honest guy, right? Because it seems like you're just lying about the most obvious shit. You can't just say, don't believe your lying eyes, and expect that that's going to work with people. And again, as pointed out here, this is something that's not only going to hurt Joe Biden personally, but it's going to hurt all of these other Democrats who are continuing to come out and defend him and say, no, I'm fully behind Joe, everything's fine, we're going to win in November. But then their voters are looking at them and they're like, why the fuck are you lying on behalf of this guy? I clearly see that he is cognitively declining at a rapid pace. Why are you lying on behalf of him? So he's like putting these Democrats in a position to either confront him and to call him out, or to basically try to gaslight their voters, which really is not going to work. Now, we also had this interesting reporting that just came out today, here from the Daily Beast. Avengers Assemble, it was a fucking headline, heavyweight new plan to try to force Biden out. Basically what they're saying is that it seems like a couple of Biden's closest like friends and allies, Chuck Schumer, Jim Clyburn, Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, a few other ones, are potentially about to get together to form what they're calling a Super Friends group. I'm not kidding, guys. That's actually what they're calling it, a Super Friends group, to go to the White House to tell Joe Biden to drop out and that it's over. It's done. So this is like one of those things that I think could actually push Joe Biden over the edge. I mean, if Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and Jim Clyburn, some of the people who helped to get him to the presidency in the first place, if they come out, and all of them are ancient as fuck, by the way, too. They're all super old and probably shouldn't be in Congress anyways, but if they all get together and go to him, could that be the thing that pushes it over the edge? I don't know. We also have this here, because apparently there's some plotting going on behind the scenes in terms of what Democrats are going to do at the DNC if Biden at that time is still refusing to step down. So we have here from David Sirota in The Lever. Some of Biden's pledged delegates are exploring a plan to use existing DNC rules, empowering them to replace Biden as the nominee at the convention, whether or not he voluntarily steps down. So this is where you get into like a total chaos kind of situation. If Biden decides willingly to step down and to go and immediately like endorse Kamala Harris or whatever, that could result in a slightly more orderly process, I think, at the DNC. But if he refuses to step down, and you have a bunch of defectors of DNC delegates who decide, well, we're actually just going to nominate somebody else, then the question is like, well, who would it be? I mean, the obvious answer, I think, is they'd probably go to Kamala Harris, I guess, even though I don't think she would be the strongest candidate, but you got to think they'd probably go to her. Maybe some of them, thinking about Newsom or Whitmer or somebody else, Pritzker maybe. But then you get into an entire, massively chaotic situation at the DNC, which I think would be incredibly entertaining. And I'm actually going to be at the DNC, so I'll be there to let you guys know what happens in real time. But I mean, this is also pretty interesting as well. I mean, it's such a wild situation. It's almost really difficult to wrap your mind around. Like, we have a totally senile president who's so senile that he can't even realize that he's cognitively declining, and he is refusing to step down and is insisting on running for re-election, even though a vast majority of voters, a vast majority of his own party, don't think that he should. And yet they can't really do anything about it, right? Or they can do something about it, but they're too cowardly to do anything about it. I mean, it's just a totally unprecedented situation that we're currently facing right now. We also have this here from donors, right? And I guess one more thing that I'll mention about this is that I don't think that this is a good precedent to set. I feel like that's important for me to say. The fact that the DNC rules potentially allow for a bunch of DNC delegates to get together and to basically plot against the nominee who voters voted for, that to me is kind of alarming and scary, right? The fact that this is like how our democracy works, because I could imagine you have some left-wing candidate, let's just say it's like Bernie Sanders or somebody, and they end up getting the most votes and the most delegates in the primary election, but then you have a bunch of like DNC elites who get together and they say, well, Bernie can't win, so we're going to nominate somebody else, and they just sort of like steal it away from him. I could easily see that kind of situation playing out, right? And we also know, obviously, how corrupt the DNC is and how they've effectively tried to rig it against Bernie twice now, back-to-back in 2016 and 2020. So I don't like this precedent being set, but at the same time, it's like, if you're a Democrat and you want to defeat Donald Trump, from that perspective, this might literally be the only thing that you can do if Biden refuses to step down. So anyways, again, we have the donors who are continuing to revolt against Joe Biden. Here's a quote from the New York Times. Some major Democratic donors have told the largest pro-Biden super PAC called Future Forward that roughly $90 million in pledged donations is now on hold if Biden remains atop the ticket. They say the frozen contributions include multiple 8-figure commitments. Again, a little bit of an insight here in terms of how broken and corrupt our so-called democracy is. The fact that you have people who can give 8-figure commitments to a political campaign, and that they have such more of a voice than average Americans, right? I mean, this is just, it's such a wildly corrupt system that we have in place here. But this is a system that Joe Biden has always, been propped up on. If it wasn't for the elites, if it wasn't for the donor class and the media, then Joe Biden would never have been the president, right? So I guess now in this situation, you kind of set up this system, and now the system is turning against you. Can't really complain about it, right? These are the people who propped you up this entire time. But again, pretty wild. $90 million being frozen as a protest against Joe Biden being at the top of the ticket. We also have some new polling data that's out, and I don't know how this is repairable. Is Biden too old for a second term? This is ABC and the Washington Post. 85% say that he's too old. 85. You cannot get 85% of Americans to agree on literally anything, right? You could ask Americans, like, should we kill puppies? And you might not get 85%. And 85% of the American people say that he's too old for a second term. How do you win with this being the reality? How do you possibly win? The only chance, the only sliver of a chance that Biden has in November, if he stays, is the fact that his opponent is Donald Trump. That's the only reason. If it was any other generic Republican against Biden, then that wouldn't even be a conversation about there being a sliver of a chance. The only sliver of a chance is because people hate Donald Trump as much, if not more, than they hate Joe Biden. But now we're at the point where, again, I don't know how this is recoverable. I really don't. We also had this here from CNN. This was pretty alarming, right? Or should be alarming, I think. And this is something that I didn't know about before yesterday. CNN is reporting that the last full cabinet meeting in the Biden administration took place on October 2nd of 2023. Guys, that is 9 months ago. 9 months ago. And they also say that when they have done these sort of cabinet meetings, they're very heavily controlled and scripted from Biden's aides and his staffers, right? But you haven't met since before October 7th. You have not met since before Israel began their genocide in Gaza. How is that even possible, guys? It's like Joe Biden is hiding from his own cabinet, and like his own cabinet members don't even know the full scope of how much he has declined mentally because they never get to see him. How is this possible, guys? And an extension of that from the same reporting here is pointed out by Nate Silver. He says this is not normal or acceptable for an American president. It sounds like a story from an authoritarian country. Here's what they say here, guys. This is crazy. Back in Washington, there have been clear signs throughout his term of the president being increasingly stage managed, with lists of talking points, names of questioners, and drawings of where he should walk presented to him by aides. Ahead of closed-door cabinet meetings that Biden attends, it is customary for cabinet officials to submit questions and key talking points that they plan to present in front of Biden ahead of time to White House aides, according to these two sources with direct knowledge. They say, quote, "The entire display is a kind of act. They would come and say, hey, the president is going to call you in about 25 minutes and ask this question. What are the bullet points that you will respond with?" The second source, who echoed the same description, said that when Biden attends cabinet meetings, they are not freewheeling and are pretty well orchestrated, and the meetings themselves are infrequent. I mean, guys, Biden is hiding from his own cabinet members in his own administration. These are his hand-picked allies, the same people who he put in these positions. And they can't even get access to him without getting a call from a White House aide saying, what are the exact things that you're going to talk to him about? And here's a list of the questions that he's going to have for you. And then you need to give me exactly what you're going to respond with. Because we need to orchestrate this entire manufactured act to make it seem as though he's still there. This is not normal, guys. This is not normal. Now, one final thing here, and I'll finish off the video. Because this should not surprise anybody. People close to Trump are thrilled about Biden's solid enough performance. It was strong enough, they perceive or hope, to keep his candidacy alive. They foresee a landslide with Biden as their opponent and would rather not have anything happen to introduce risk, change, or uncertainty. The status quo is their clear preference, even if they hardly fear Kamala Harris. So Republicans, Trump allies, are celebrating because they think, as I've seen many liberals try to claim, that Joe Biden's press conference from last night, he had a couple of gaffes, but it wasn't so bad that the floodgates are going to completely open. But it wasn't good enough that it convinced anybody that he's actually fine. So it's like this terrible purgatory middle ground that we're stuck in here. And Republicans are celebrating that. They love it. They want the fact that they want Joe Biden to be their opponent should tell you everything. That should tell you everything. I think basically any other generic Democrat could probably have a better shot against Trump than Joe Biden, and definitely wouldn't hurt down ballot Democrats nearly as much. So all of this is, again, completely insane that we're in this situation. It's totally unprecedented. We got a senile man in the White House refusing to step aside, and I guess the only hope at this point is that like some Democratic elites and politicians will somehow force him to step down from the race. And if that doesn't happen, then God help us.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying